So the parade of dull, CGI-heavy blockbusters has finally wheezed its last, and now we get to pick over the bloated carcass, trying to find out what the hell went wrong with 2016. Because on paper, there was no cinematic offering that sounded like an absolute stinker. True, there was no offering that sounded amazing, but for the amount of money that was spent, the returns were absolutely shocking. Now, obviously the film that everyone's focusing on is Suicide Squad, which according to backstage sources needs to take $750 million just to break even. And now that it's been denied entry to China, I just can't see that happening. And to make enough profit to have been worth everyone's while, it would need to take at least $1.5 billion, or become the 5th highest grossing film of all time between The Avengers and Furious 7, and that's just not going to happen. But what about Ghostbusters, the most pointlessly controversial film of the year? That's on course to lose $70 million, and despite allegedly renaming itself the Superpower Dare Die Team, which I would watch in a heartbeat, was again refused a license in China because, well, most films that promote cults or superstitious beliefs get rejected by the film State Board. Don't worry though, because franchise-desperate Sony is still going to be making more films under the Ghostbusters name. It's just going to be animated and released in 2019. Now before I go on, a quick note about how much films cost. Whilst finding out the filming budget is relatively easy, finding out how much the advertising costs is next to impossible. So a general rule of thumb is to assume that the amount spent advertising is roughly the same amount as was spent in making it. Which is why the 2005 movie Sahara, despite being a pretty solid action-adventure film, managed to lose over $105 million. Back to 2016. What about the already forgotten Independence Day sequel? Whilst it did take $382.1 million against a budget of $165, you might think that this counts as a hit, right? Except when you factor in the marketing. It costs roughly the same as it took, leaving the heavily hinted at sequel in severe doubt. Hell, even Star Trek Beyond, released in the franchise's 50th year, with such an inbuilt fan base that it should have turned a profit in its sleep, took $212.5 million against a budget of $185. Which again doesn't factor in advertising costs, meaning that a fourth film is probably going to happen, but it will do so with a reduced budget. Finally, The Nice Guys, the lone film in the last 3 months that I've given my highest rating to, $57 million against a $50 million budget. The sequel probably isn't going to happen, despite the fact the film currently has a 91% approval rating on Rotten Tomatoes. Now, films failing to make money isn't something new. I mean, according to the paperwork, Return of the Jedi is still in loss. But with the amount of big-budgeted films released this summer, that only Finding Dory and Civil War, depending on when you think the summer blockbuster season begins, are making anything like the type of money that these films need to make in order to be worth anyone's time, we really need to have a look at film, because this high-risk, high-reward strategy just isn't sustainable. Backstory. When Star Wars Episode 1 The Phantom Menace was released in 1999, its budget was $115 million, which back at the time was a shocking amount. People were convinced that it would never ever make its money back, and now people would be worried that the budget would be too small. A comparable film, Guardians of the Galaxy, released in 2014, required a budget of $232.3 million. And yet, for the 2 years I've been reviewing, as well as all the years that I've been a film buff, the only recent blockbusters that I enjoyed so much that I would watch again, let alone own, I could probably count on one hand. A major part of this is the growth of CGI, meaning that we could do things in films that were unimaginable 20 years ago when I was growing up. But on the flip side, decent CGI is horrifically expensive, and to my mind will never look as good as either a practical effect or even the nearly extinct art of stop motion. A good way forward would be to treat CGI as a glacé cherry. Used sparingly, it can be a rather nice treat, but used to excess, it loses its effectiveness quickly and can make me feel rather sick. Now, we also need to talk about the effect that Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy has had. Sadly, not in bringing back model work and practical effects, but in convincing movie executives that all films need to be dark and gritty. Now, obviously an exception is the Marvel Universe, but I'm going to get to that later. But in general, most films this summer were dark, depressing, with no witty banter or actually interesting dialogue. Seriously people, special effects and A and B list actors can only take a movie so far. It's writing a good, decent script that establishes interesting characters over time, that is more memorable and is more likely to be watched again and again and again than these CGI heavy explosion and cardboard character cutout filled things. And bringing things back to Marvel movies, one thing I am beginning to get seriously annoyed at is the setting up of cinematic universe. Something that's happened in the last few years is that a film isn't really allowed to tell a complete story. Because blockbuster films are so expensive to make and market, it's easier to try to make every film the next episode of an ongoing saga than to try and create new films with new characters every time. And whilst I do understand this, it means that I never really feel anything at the end of the film. And it never used to be like this. Indiana Jones, Star Trek, even my own beloved James Bond franchise never really bothered with continuity until the last few years. They didn't need to. And I miss films that end, and no film this summer ended. Even The Nice Guys sequel baited desperately. And while sequel baiting has been a part of film since forever, it typically happened after the film had wrapped up and lasted for less than 30 seconds. It wasn't happening continually during the damn film. Things have to change, because cinema's that more profitable than they have ever been. And there are some small movies that come out and are awesome, but more and more they're just getting drowned out by unimaginative sludge that, like the Blob, just keeps coming and coming and coming no matter what you do. I mean, Sony is so desperate for a franchise that it overlooks the fact that its mid-budget movies are actually pretty good and reliably make $200 to $300 million at the box office. But when everyone else is making billions, who can blame them? But what did you guys think of this summer? I'm Daniel, this has been a What on Earth. If you've enjoyed this video, please like, share and subscribe.